A big unknown for people retiring is understanding exactly how much their living expenses will be. Not just at the moment of retirement, but more importantly, how those expenses will change over time. When you're working, this doesn't really matter as much because you assume your income will also change over time. As expenses fluctuate, you can naturally adjust your spending based on your salary. You have the flexibility to control expenses relative to your income. In retirement, however, you don't have that same luxury. Instead, you rely on a lump sum, your portfolio, to cover your living expenses throughout retirement. This is something you want to get right from the start because you can't simply work overtime or extend your career by a few more years to make up for any miscalculations. If you don't know what your expenses will be, it creates anxiety. You worry that you might be spending too much, and that fear can make it difficult to fully enjoy retirement. By understanding how retirement expenses typically behave, you can gain a better idea of what your own expenses might look like. This, in turn, allows you to create a solid financial plan and enter retirement with greater peace of mind. So today, we're going to talk about exactly that. Not everyone is average, of course, but by examining average retirement expenses, we can gain valuable insights. Most retirees follow a general spending pattern. How much do they spend at the beginning of retirement? How does spending change in the middle years? And what happens in the later years? When most people approach financial planning, they start by estimating their expenses for the first year of retirement, then inflating that amount by 3% annually, or some other inflation factor, to maintain purchasing power over time. That's how financial planning has traditionally been done. However, David Blanchett challenged this approach in his 2014 article, Exploring the Retirement Consumption Puzzle. Using empirical data, he demonstrated that living expenses in retirement don't simply increase at a fixed rate. Instead, they change over time in a pattern that's different from the typical straight-line inflation model. Blanchett analyzed data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which tracks the spending habits of American households. This survey, conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the U.S. Census Bureau, provided a wealth of data to help answer the key question: how do expenses change over time? Two primary factors were considered. First, how does inflation affect retiree expenses? Second, how do actual spending patterns evolve throughout retirement? Let's start with inflation. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, measures inflation across the economy, but retirees don't spend money in the same way as younger individuals. A 65-year-old retiree spends differently than a 30-year-old worker, allocating more money toward healthcare and less toward education, transportation, or clothing. Because healthcare costs tend to rise faster than overall inflation, retiree expenses typically increase at a rate higher than the general inflation rate. In fact, there's a specialized index called the CPIE, Consumer Price Index for the elderly, that better reflects the inflation rate experienced by retirees. This version of the CPI places greater emphasis on medical expenses and other costs that disproportionately affect older Americans. However, the second part of the study looked at actual spending behavior, and that's where things got interesting. From ages 65 to 85, spending doesn't just increase linearly, it actually tends to decrease over time. The research found that, on average, retiree spending declines by about 1% to 2% per year in real terms, after adjusting for inflation. To illustrate, imagine a retiree spends $100 on groceries this year. If inflation is 3%, then to maintain the same level of grocery purchases next year, they would need to spend $103. But in reality, the study found that retirees tend to increase spending to only $101 or $102, meaning their real inflation-adjusted spending declines over time. While nominal spending, the actual dollars spent, rises slightly, real spending falls. The study showed that by the time retirees reach their early to mid-80s, they are spending approximately 75% to 80% of what they were spending at age 65, after adjusting for inflation. This means that if a retiree spends $100,000 per year at age 65, by age 85, that same retiree will be spending somewhere between $75,000 and $80,000 per year in real terms. Even though retiree expenses experience higher than average inflation due to rising medical costs, the overall spending trajectory declines over time. This concept was popularized by Michael Stein in his book, The Prosperous Retirement, where he described 3 phases of retirement: the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. Early in retirement, retirees are more active. They travel, dine out, and engage in expensive hobbies. In the middle of retirement, they're still enjoying life, but tend to slow down, traveling less and spending less on entertainment. In the later years, they spend even less as health issues limit activities. Excluding medical expenses, retiree spending tends to decline throughout retirement. However, around ages 80 to 85, medical expenses begin to rise, increasing overall costs. That said, on average, total retirement spending, even including medical costs, never fully returns to the peak levels of early retirement in real inflation-adjusted terms. Studies show that spending patterns in retirement typically follow a smile-shaped curve. In the early years of retirement, expenses tend to be the highest as retirees travel more, dine out frequently, and engage in hobbies. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average retiree household spends $52,141 per year, with 35% of that going toward housing and 15% toward healthcare. This phase, usually between ages 60 and 70, is when discretionary spending is at its peak. By mid-retirement, typically between ages 70 and 80, spending tends to decline. Many retirees travel less, downsize their homes, and spend less on entertainment. The Employee Benefit Research Institute, EBRI, found that retirees reduce their spending by about 15% by age 75. This drop is mainly due to a less active lifestyle and a shift away from discretionary expenses. Later in retirement, usually after age 80, spending begins to rise again, primarily due to increasing medical and long-term care expenses. Fidelity estimates that a 65-year-old couple retiring today will need about $315,000 to cover healthcare costs throughout retirement. Assisted living, home care, and other health-related expenses start taking a larger portion of retirees' budgets. However, on average, total spending in this phase remains lower than in the early years of retirement. This is Whiteboard Finance. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Until next time.